So welcome to the next session of Conclave. We have Gnosticism and Carl Jung with Dr. Stuart Douglas. Stuart has had a lifelong interest in the mysteries and completed his PhD in transpersonal psychology in parallel with a career as a systems analyst. His specialist areas of interest include the intersection of Jungian psychology and Gnosticism, which he literally wrote a book on, and more generally, ancient wisdom, shamanic practice, and contemplative traditions. When not pursuing these interests or rendering unto Caesar, a line I quite like, because I work for Caesar, so he spends his time hiking in the mountains somewhere or plotting his escape from the Matrix. So, once again, it's a pleasure to see you in the flesh after so many years. So with that, I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can I just have a sound check? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
And is my screen sharing?
Yep.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invite. It would be wonderful if we could all be doing this in person, but we're in strange times, and it's great we have the technology that we can all meet around the world. So I'll press on. I've titled the presentation Whiteboard, Black Serpent, Red Book. Hopefully that the reason for that will become apparent during my speech, but it's basically a summary of my doctoral research which explored the Gnostic roots of Jungian psychology, and it's probably an area of Jungian psychology that most people in Jungian circles certainly are not aware of, just how profoundly influenced Jung was by the Gnostics. Even though Nag Hammadi was not available to him, which wasn't discovered till 45, he had a few Gnostic texts available to him. Nevertheless, his psychology is firmly rooted in the Gnostic texts and Gnostic principles, which I hope to demonstrate. So I'll press on. A brief agenda, again, looking at the Gnostic roots of his psychology. Presentation, about 60 minutes. I've prepared a slide deck. To be honest, I haven't timed it, so we'll see how we go. I'll give a brief introduction to Carl Jung, and the emphasis on brief. I'm assuming everyone's heard of Carl Jung. Some people will know him a bit better than others, but it will just be a brief introduction for those who are not familiar with him. And then I want to look at the Gnostic roots of his psychology, as mentioned, and I want to do that by looking at two texts that he wrote. The 7 Sermons to the Dead, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with, and also an essay he wrote called The Transcendent Function, which I would equally be sure that most of you probably haven't heard of, or if you have, probably aren't so familiar with. And forgive me if that's not the case, but most Jungians are not that familiar with that essay. I also want to make some reference to the Gnostic texts, specifically Nag Hammadi. And then I'll ask the question and hopefully provide some sort of answer. Was Jung Gnostic? Can we consider Jung to be a Gnostic? And then, in keeping with the theme of Conclave, a brief look at what we can get from Jung in terms of a Gnostic praxis for the modern day. Then a few closing remarks, and then a question and answer session. If you have any burning questions you really want to ask, then please do, but I'd prefer questions at the end simply because it's just too difficult to see hands going up during the presentation. So I'll press on. So Carl Jung has given the moniker the Wizard of Kuznach by Bishop Stephen Heller. I'm not quite sure how he pronounced that, which I thought was an interesting title. But anyway, Carl Jung, Swiss psychologist, born in 1875 and died in 1961. So the fairly recent past, born near Lake Constance in Switzerland, and often described as the heir apparent or indeed the crown prince of Sigmund Freud's emerging field of depth psychology. And I guess he's about half a generation after Freud, and they were very close for a while, and then he had a significant break. But Jung was destined to basically take over from Freud until they had that break in. I'll get into a little bit of that shortly. And once he broke from Jung, he established his own psychology, which is formally known as analytical psychology, but more colloquially just referred to as Jungian psychology. And it was Jung who introduced me to the Gnostics and Gnosticism. And I first came across the term when I read his memoirs, Memories, Dreams and Reflections, probably about 25 years ago now. And I had never heard the term. And it was just, I was going through a period in my own life when I just a thirst for anything alternative. And when I came across that term in his book, I just thought, oh, that's interesting. That's something I'll have to explore a bit later. Little did I know, about 20 years later, I'd be doing some doctoral studies on that very same topic. So moving on, Jung's Gnostic roots. So in this section, as I mentioned, I'm going to be looking at the 7 Sermons to the Dead and the Transcendent Function. As I mentioned, a profound influence that the Gnostics had on his psychology through these two texts. And specifically, I want to explore this claim that Jung made that all his major contributions to psychology were pre-configured in the 7 Sermons. And I would suspect that is something which is glossed over by most Jungian psychologists, mainstream Jungian psychologists, if I could say that. There just seems a reluctance to acknowledge that aspect of his psychology, which I guess is that mystical. And I think those Jungian psychologists, they just want to keep his psychology in the mainstream, if indeed it could be considered in the mainstream. So yeah, all these major ideas are Gnostic in essence. And I also want to highlight some of the correspondences between those two texts and the Gnostic text of Nag Hammadi. So, as I mentioned, he had a very close relationship with Sigmund Freud initially, but then around 1913, he had this break with Freud, and it plunged him into a period of his life which he described as his confrontation with the unconscious. Some people have described that as a psychotic episode, a bout of madness. But what he was experiencing at that time was this flood of images that just burst forward from the unconscious. And he struggled to come to terms with that. But during that period, all his major ideas of his psychology came to him during that period. And it was during this period that he wrote the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which we'll get to shortly. So as I mentioned, 1913, the painful with Freud, and what he himself described as the most significant period of his professional life in which the foundations of his psychology were laid. The intense part of that period was 1914 to 1918, which should be obvious. That was in the backdrop of World War I, and I'm sure that what was going on, it was profoundly significant in that period. And as mentioned, that material that burst forth and emerged from his unconscious threatened to overwhelm him, which he attests to in his memoirs. And he describes himself in the language of the medieval alchemists, that it was the prime material for his lifetime's work. Okay, and here's a quote. He says, "The years when I pursued these inner images that burst forth during that confrontation from the unconscious were the most important of his life. Everything else was to be derived from them. And his entire life, or his professional life, consisted in elaborating those themes that had come to him." And as he says, it was just the outer classification, scientific elaboration and integration into life. But the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then. And that period is shortly after he'd been studying the Gnostic texts that were available to him during that time. And in that period, he wrote the 7 Sermons. So the whole of Jungian psychology can be traced back to that Gnostic-inspired text that we know as the 7 Sermons. Okay. The two documents that I mentioned, I refer to them as twin texts, which I hope to explain. the Seven Sermons and the Transcendent Function. They were both written in 1916 during the midst of that confrontation with the unconscious. One I would describe as the raw material of what was bursting forth from the unconscious, and that became the Seven Sermons to the Dead. And the other one I see is the psychological process, the heart of the method, which was active imagination, which he used to try and understand and integrate the experience, but then articulate it in more psychological terms. So I see the intersection of Gnosticism and Jungian psychology as existing or manifesting in those two texts written in the same year, the Seven Sermons to the Dead and the Transcendent Function, which I like to describe, as I mentioned, the twin texts, or otherwise two sides of the same coin. And as mentioned, I'll make some references to the Nag Hammadi library, which I'm sure you're all far more familiar with than me. So just a couple of factoids on them. Discovered in 1945 in Upper Egypt, I'm sure you're all aware of that. Composed by some Christian monks near a monastery in a place called Chemboskian, consisting of 13 papyrus codices written in Coptic. And I wasn't aware of this till I started my research. They're the oldest known leather-bound books which have ever been discovered, which I find quite remarkable. Apologies for the grainy image. Hopefully you can see that, but when you think of documents from antiquity manifesting as papyrus scrolls or clay tablets, you don't really think of them as books that you might find in your grandmother's attic, but there you are. And something some of you may not be aware of, the first codex that made its way out of Egypt is known as the Jung Codex, and it was purchased by the Jung Institute and presented as a gift to Jung on, I think it was his 80th birthday. And I think that just is a testament just how well known in some circles it was of the influence the Gnostics had in Jung. Okay, so the Seven Sermons to the Dead. The Seven Sermons to the Dead were never publicly published during Jung's lifetime, but he did have a copy privately published and circulated amongst his closest associates, and he subtitled that private publication as the Seven Instructions to the Dead, written by Basilides in Alexandria, where the East touches the West. And I think it's quite important that East touches the West phrase. I don't think he's just referring to a geospatial description there. I think he's talking about the opposites, and that theme of the opposites will recur again and again in his work, if you read any of his work, but I'll make a constant reference to it during this presentation. So on to the Red Book. The Red Book, published in 2009, it's Jung's personal journal documenting the outcomes of his engagement with the inner psychological process during that confrontation with the unconscious, along with his interpretation and the meaning and their significance. And the process he used to come to terms with that material is a process called active imagination, and I'll get into that in a bit more detail when we talk about the Transcendent Function. And here's how I describe it in my own book. Active imagination is a technique that he developed for eliciting and developing the fantasies, the aim of which is to engage and assimilate unconscious content, either dreams, reveries, and so on, by giving a voice to those aspects of the psyche that are not normally heard, and then establishing a dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious. Okay, on to the Red Book a bit more. So these fantasies, that was Jung's English word for how we describe them, but they were more, that sort of sanitizes them somewhat. They really were profound, overwhelming content, like bursting forth from the unconscious. So fantasy doesn't really do it justice, but it was the word he used. And initially he documented those in a series of books called the Black Books, and then he later transcribed them into what he called the Red Book, and then was published as a Red Book. And it was an endeavour that took him years and years to do, so it was obviously a labour of love. And it exists in the format of a medieval illuminated manuscript, which has been likened to the Book of Kells from Ireland, if you're familiar with that. And it consists of three parts: Liber Primus, Liber Secundus, which were a transcription of those early fantasies, and then the third part he called Scrutinies, which, as the name suggests, he's trying to understand and pull together his fantasies from the first couple of parts of the book. And the 7 sermons belongs in that third part. So in many ways, the 7 sermons is it's almost like a summary of what he gleaned from those explorations. And these images, which I've shamelessly plagiarized off the internet, are from the Red Book. And some of them are absolutely astounding. And this was part of his method of active imagination, by drawing and painting some of the images that came to him. It was actually part of the process of engaging with the material, giving it an expression. So I've just included many of these in the slides just to give you a flavour of the degree and of which he engaged with the material, and it went into this book, the Red Book. So as mentioned, the 7 sermons scrutinised the raw material of parts 1 and part 2 and distilled it into his unique Gnostic vision that we know as the 7 sermons. Sonny Shamdasani, who's the editor of the Red Book, he describes it as a psychological cosmology cast in the form of a Gnostic creation myth, and I think that's a very apt description. Jung himself described it as written under the direction of an inner spiritual guide that he referred to as Philemon, which he has drawn on the right there. You can see his description or depiction of Philemon. In his memoirs, he said it was written over 3 evenings after a parapsychological encounter, which he described as the spirits of the dead. And that's where we get the 7 sermons to the dead. That claim of 3 evenings has been challenged. Some people think, looking at the dates on some of his work, that it was written over a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but nevertheless, it was written over a very short period of time in his life. Okay, the first concept that emerges in the 7 sermons is this concept of the pleroma, which a Greek word meaning the fullness. Gnostic myths are typically monist in the terms that there's a single unified whole underpinning reality. And similarly, Jung's Gnostic myth starts with that monist principle. And he opens the 7 sermons by introducing this concept, as I mentioned, the pleroma, meaning the fullness or the wholeness. And he begins, I begin with nothingness. Nothingness, the name is the same as fullness. In infinity, full is as good as empty. Nothing is empty and full. That which is endless and eternal has no qualities. Since it has all qualities, we call it the nothingness or fullness, the pleroma. So straight away we see this idea of the conjunction of the opposites. And that's right in the first lines of the 7 sermons, this theme of the opposites. And we can see something very similar in some of the Gnostic texts. So here we have in the secret book of John, the one is sovereign that has nothing over it. It is God and Father of all, the invisible one that is over all, is incorruptible, the pure light, no eye can gaze, the one is the invisible spirit. So again, we see the idea of the oneness in the beginning. Also in some of the Gnostic texts, specifically in this case, the trimorphic protonoia, we have this idea of the opposites, or the syzygies, or the conjunction of the opposites together. I think of the first thought, silent, sound, invisible, visible, and so on. So like Jung's concept of the pleroma, the one is complete, existing beyond deity itself, beyond existence itself, and containing everything within it. In other words, both Jung's pleroma and the Gnostics' concept of the one is both nothingness and fullness at the same time. And in both Jung's Gnostic myth as well as the Gnostic, the creation myths of the Gnostics, creation proceeds out of a primal being, or more accurately, a non-being. And it typically proceeds through a series of emanations, where each emanation is a pair of opposites. Indeed, inseparable pairs of opposites. For example, in Thunder, Perfect Mind, we have the first and the last, the honour and the scorn, knowledge and ignorance. So again, we have this idea of those conjunction of the opposites that exist in the oneness, or the fullness of the pleroma, and then creation proceeds from those opposites. Another principle that, or influence that Jung drew on was Meister Eckhart, whom he considered to be the greatest of the Christian mystics. And he says that in Eckhart, he found the breath of life. And what he borrowed on was Eckhart's concept of the Godhead, which in German is Grund, or this idea of the ground or the Godhead, which is the ground of all being, is the divine in potentiality out of which everything emerges. So Godhead rather than God, and I think we can see a parallel in both the Gnostics' idea of the oneness out of which everything emerges, and also Jung's concept of the pleroma out of which everything emerges. So like I say, the pleroma is more like the Godhead rather than the God. And here we have a quote from Eckhart just explaining that God and Godhead are as different from each other as heaven and earth. So yeah, the Godhead, there is nothing to talk about. God acts, whereas Godhead does not. The difference between God and the Godhead is a difference between action and non-action. And elsewhere, I think Eckhart said that God is at rest, it's we have gone out for a walk. And so I think we have God at home, or God as the Godhead at home, whereas creation proceeds from the Godhead and first emerges as God. And we'll see that in Jung's conceptualization as well. And out of that idea of the pleroma, we have one of Jung's major contributions to psychology, and that's this idea of the collective unconscious, which exists as part of Jung's three-part model of consciousness, which we have here on the right. I hope you can see that. So we have the conscious, which is just what we're conscious of in the everyday world. We have the personal unconscious, and we have the collective unconscious. Jung described the collective unconscious as collective in nature, both universal and impersonal, or elsewhere he described it as a collective psychic substratum, which is universal and collective to us all. He described it as inherited, objective, common to all people and in all times and all places. It was there before any of us existed, and it will be there once we're all gone. And here we can see a reference to the pleroma, or the concept of the pleroma, and where it influences his idea of the collective unconscious. He says, we call the collective unconscious nothing, and yet it is a reality in potentia. So it's everything and nothing. And drawing in my IT background, the way I like to describe it is, I think of it as the collective conscious, which we all have, would be akin to our desktop. It's what we're conscious of in the present moment. It's the applications, if you like, that are open on our desktop. Whereas the personal unconscious would be like our personal hard drive. It's unique to us. It contains all those files, many of which we've forgotten about. Some of them we're aware of, and we can go and rummage around and find and bring it into our desktop. And then the collective unconscious, I would describe that is the internet. Everything's out there, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We can draw in some of it we're not even aware of. Some of it we could go and root around and we could find some of it, and some of us will just never get to. So the key difference here is the collective unconscious is shared by all of us. as opposed to the personal dimensions of consciousness. The next key concept in the seven sermons is this idea of differentiation. Most Gnostic texts, especially the Sethian ones, are a cosmogony followed by an anthropogony. The seven sermons is somewhat different. It tends to address the creation of human consciousness. And I think if we look at some of the latest findings of quantum physics, which I've only dabbled in and know precious little about, but there's an inextricable link between what we perceive as reality and consciousness. And there is no, as far as I understand, there is no objective reality. Consciousness creates that perception of reality. So in that light, I think we can think of cosmogony and the creation of human consciousness as basically one and the same thing. For Jung, in the seven sermons, differentiation is creation and creation is differentiation. And the creation for Jung comes about as an act of differentiation of those conjoined opposites that exist in pleroma. And for Jung, non-differentiation is unconsciousness and differentiation is consciousness. And that's a key item which I'll return to throughout this presentation. And it's a crucial difference between Jung and the Gnostics. And this brings us to the idea of the opposites. Jung introduces the concept of what he calls the creatura, which is just the created being, and he sees it as a differentiation of opposites emerging out of the pleroma. And there's a clear parallel there between the Valentinian concept of creation as an emanation out of the Godhead versus Jung's concept of differentiation. And for Jung, it's specifically differentiation of pairs of opposites. And he claims that without the opposite, nothing works, and things remain inert. And he also states in his psychological writings, nothing can exist but by virtue of a balancing opposites. And these opposites, as mentioned, emerge out of the pleroma. So here's straight out the seven sermons. If we do not differentiate, we move beyond our essence, beyond creation, and we fall into non-differentiation, which is the quality of the pleroma. We fall into the pleroma itself and cease to be created beings. We lapse into dissolution of nothingness. This is death of the creature. We die to the same extent that we do not differentiate. So for Jung, non-differentiating, we fall back into the pleroma or the Godhead or the collective unconscious, which for Jung he describes as a death and perhaps not a good thing. Which, on the other hand, I think throughout some of the Gnostic texts, and I've quoted here from the Gospel of Philip, light and darkness, life and death, right and left are children. They are inseparably together. So we have that theme in Jung's concept of the pleroma, the inseparable opposites. But here in the Gnostics is good or not good, wicked is not wicked, life not death, life not life, death not death. Each element fades into an original source, but those who live above the world cannot fade, they are eternal. So for the Gnostics, going back into the oneness, back into pleroma is eternal life, but for Jung, it's death. So that's the crucial difference and the key crucial difference, I think, between the Gnostics' conceptualization of the oneness with its opposites and Jung's conceptualization of the pleroma and its opposites. So a bit more in the pleroma and the created being. The pleroma pervades creation in Jung's conceptualization, and creation is in the pleroma. So his cosmology is panentheistic, I would suggest. And he describes creation as of the pleroma, but distinct by way of its differentiation. So the creation, its essence is of the pleroma, but it's differentiated by way of the concept of differentiation. And there's a parallel here between the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who talks about phenomenal and the noumenal aspects of a thing. The phenomena as it appears to us and as we perceive it, and the noumenal aspect is in its essence. So for Jung, creatura has the same essence as the pleroma. It has a noumenal identification with the pleroma, but is phenomenologically different. So it's a bit like the divine spark. It's of the great invisible spirit, if you like, but in this world it's distinct, but has the same essence. And I think in this concept of the creatura, we have a very early configuration of Jung's concept of the archetype, which has been described as Jung's most challenging concept. I wouldn't disagree with that description. The best way to think of the archetype is a pre-existent form, a universal pattern, a universal motif. And Jung describes it as present always and everywhere, and exists in the collective unconscious. Another way of thinking of the archetype, it's like a psychic blueprint that shapes human behavior, or the archetypes are to the psyche what the instincts are to physiology. And as mentioned, the archetypes belong in the collective unconscious. Jung describes them as empty and purely formal. And again, we see that reference to Kantian philosophy, whereas there's the archetype per se, which is the noumenal aspect of the archetype, and then we have the experience of the archetype, which would be the phenomenological experience of the archetype. Or we could say that the archetype per se is a transcendent object, which, whereas the experience of the archetype comes in imagery, in the immanence of our experience. And in contrast to the Gnostics, whereas the Godhead is alien and foreign, there's no distance between the pleroma and creation in Jung's conceptualization, and there's no distance between the archetypes and its images that we might experience in dreams and reverie and fantasies and so on. So the way I wrote about this is differentiation brings the pairs of opposites and the whole of creation into existence. Without differentiation, the opposites are in potentia only, cancelled out by one another, and cannot be considered to exist at all. Without differentiation, creation would cease to exist and dissolve into the nothingness of the pleroma. In the pleroma, the opposites are undifferentiated and balanced. In creation, they are differentiated and held in an effective state of tension. Another concept is, in the Gnostics, is that creation is an error. Creation came into being as an error. For example, the world was conceived in ignorance by Sophia's imperfect, misshapen bastard child. That's from the Secret Book of John. Or in the Origin of the World, creation is out of the shadow of chaos, outside the infinite light, and so on. This is noticeably absent from the Seven Sermons. Nowhere in Seven Sermons is a concept of creation as an error. Rather, differentiation is the origin of life and the life essence of the creature. That it derives from this differentiation, which Jung describes as a struggling against primeval perilous sameness. And here we just have, in distinction to that, we have from the Gospel of Philip this idea of error. The world came into being through error by the demiurge. I'm sure you're all familiar with that passage. And in this idea of differentiation, we have another one of Jung's key concepts, is the concept of individuation, and differentiation is a precursor to that. Individuation is Jung's process of the drive towards psychological wholeness, which okay, so an instinctual drive towards consciousness through the differentiation of opposites. So again, we have this idea of the differentiation of those opposites creating consciousness, and without that differentiation, there is no consciousness. And that for Jung is the entelechy of the human being. Jung himself describes individuation as the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual that is a separate, indivisible unity or whole, or becoming a single homogeneous being. So I'll leave you to read that for a second. So a key point I would bring out of that, individuation through differentiation is self-realization for Jung. I think is a key point there. A bit more on the opposites. The opposites is one of the most significant themes. It's throughout the Red Book. And the whole of Jung psychology is a working out of these themes that emerged. And his psychology is, in essence, the reconciliation of the opposites, specifically through symbol formation. And that theme carries into the 7 sermons, where the theme is the fundamental need to become conscious of the opposites. Jung states that life is born only in the spark of those opposites. And I would suggest that reality as we perceive it is founded in those differentiation of opposites. There's no up without down, there's no hot without cold, and so on. So just recapping somewhat, the opposites are differentiated in creation and have distinct yet interdependent existence. And I think that we can describe that as a dualistic monism, if that's not a contradiction in terms. We have this idea of a single ultimate reality that is whole in itself, and yet it contains within it dualities or polar opposites or syzygies. Again, recapping, the opposites are phenomenally distinct but nominally identical. And in Jung's conceptualization, it's an illusion to think that we can have one without the other. And he states, everything we ask of God produces a deed from the devil. Everything created by the sun god gives effective power to the devil. For Jung, you can't have one without the other. And we see a parallel in the Tao Te Ching, which was another influence in Jungian psychology. I'll just pause a moment to let you read through that. I've got an eye on the time. I might speed up a little bit because I've got quite a few slides to get through. More in the opposites. Yeah, Jung's final major work, which he described as his opus, is Mysterium Conjunctionis, the mystery of the conjunction, which he subtitled An Inquiry into the Separation and Synthesis of Psychic Opposites in Alchemy. So again, we have this idea, the whole of Jungian psychology is the ultimate integration of psychic opposites, and that idea comes out of the 7 sermons. He states that it's imperative to maintain a balance of these opposites, and that became a psychological dictum of the whole of Jungian psychology. Without this inner dynamic, what unconscious dynamics we don't bring forth into consciousness, he said we would have to encounter in the outer world, and we call it fate. So there, just recapping that idea, differentiation and subsequent integration of the opposite is the fundamental principles of Jungian psychology. Any one-sidedness of consciousness, of the conscious orientation, will invoke a compensatory opposition in the unconscious. I'm going to skip through that. And here we have this idea, another one of Jung's major contributions to psychology, is the concept of the shadow, pre-configured by this concept of differentiation. So in this Jung's admonition to avoid the danger of striving for one pole of the opposites, we have an embryonic form of the shadow. If we strive only for one side of a pair of opposites, then the opposite pole will fall into unconsciousness in what Jung described as the shadow. And we can consider the shadow as the generally unconscious inferior part of the personality, which embodies everything that an individual does not want to acknowledge about him or herself. In other words, it's what we psychologically sweep under the carpet. It's what we want to disown, we don't want to admit to. It's socially taboo. It doesn't fit with that persona that we like to project out into the world. It just falls into the unconscious psychological concept that we call the shadow. And again, it's this idea of the opposites. If we only acknowledge one side of a pair of opposites, its opposite will fall into the shadow, which leads us to the concept of Abraxas. In talking to the dead, to which the 7 sermons are addressed to, they say to Jung, we want to know about God. Where is God? Is God dead? To which Jung replies, God is as alive as ever. However, this is a very different God, a God you knew nothing about. You have forgotten him. We call him by the name Abraxas. And there's a symbol of Abraxas on the left there. And Jung had a ring made up with that symbol on it, which he wore for the rest of his life, apparently. And it was that symbol of Abraxas, which I think is a testament just to how profoundly influenced he was by the Gnostics. So Abraxas exists in that liminal space between the pleroma, and as the opposites start to differentiate and we come into creation. And I describe it as Abraxas is partaking of both the pleroma and creation, not fully identified with either, but rather more created than creator, a God rather than the Godhead. And as Jung says, the devil always belongs to the God. And Abraxas embodies both God and devil. So in Jung's conceptualization in Gnostic creation myth, Abraxas is the first emanation who stands above God and devil and unites them both. And I see a parallel between this idea of motion and rest. You know, if God, the Godhead, is at rest, then Abraxas is the first motion. It's like the God that's got his foot out of the door of the pleroma and is entering into creation, so to speak. Jung describes Abraxas as the hermaphrodite of the earliest beginning. So we have still have this idea of the co-joined opposites, but starting to differentiate two natures in one. So I describe it as a not quite differentiated being with a close parallel between the male-female syzygies that characterize the Valentinian texts and also the androgynous eons of the Sethian texts. Excuse me. So putting it together in diagrammatic form, I think we have the pleroma in its most undifferentiated form. We have the opposites, the emptiness, and then getting towards the beginning of creation, we have the fullness, which would be undifferentiated opposites. As we emerge into creation, we have Abraxas, which is the paired God and devil. And then as we have increasing differentiation, we have what Jung described as Creatura, which is differentiated opposites. A bit more about Abraxas. Jung describes him as terrible. He is love in its murder, saint in its betrayer, worship him as death, to fear him as wisdom. That is terrible, Abraxas. He's not God, he's not your friend. And Jung equates him with the demiurge. And interestingly, in the Red Book, Jung describes him as having the image of a snake and the countenance of a lion, which I find remarkable that we get this exact same thing appearing in the Secret Book of John, where Abraxas, or the demiurge, is described as having the figure of a snake and the face of a lion, the same imagery, and yet Jung had no access to the Nag Hammadi. So he was definitely tapping into a Gnostic undercurrent, without a doubt, in my opinion. A bit more on Abraxas. Mindful of time, I'm going to skip across some of these. The important point is the distinction between Jung's Gnostic myth and the Gnostic myths of antiquity is that rather than the celestial God who descends from above, Abraxas is the chthonic God who emerges from the depths. And in his psychological formulations, that depths is the collective unconscious. We see in the 7 sermons this idea of the Numinous, first termed by the German theologian Rudolf Otto, who described the Numinous, or used the term the Numinous to describe the experience of the sacred, describing it as an awful and fascinating mystery. And I think to experience Jung's concept of Abraxas, would be to experience the awful, fascinating mystery of the divine. And Jung describes it as you must be in the middle of life, surrounded by death on all sides, stretched out like one crucified. You hang in him, the fearful and the overpowering. So the human experience for Jung in the conceptualization of Abraxas is we have God and devil, and we're crucified between God and devil. And in one of his more sort of prosaic, psychological, sanitized utterances, he described God as referring to all the events of life that cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of life for better or worse. So again, we have that concept of God embodying those opposites. And I'm pretty sure he had Abraxas in mind when he described God as such. Whitebird, Black Serpent, from which I got the title of my own book. In the fifth and sixth sermons, they're dedicated to perhaps the most important syzygy, spirituality and sexuality, which for Jung are opposites. They're not distinct, separate phenomena. They, again, are the two sides of one coin. So for Jung, it's the expression of the Chthonic spirit, the dark side of the God image. And humanity exists at the intersection of these two interdependent forces. Spirituality defined in imagery as the white bird, and sexuality as the black serpent. And again, we have this concept of life is born only in the spark of opposites. And there, I've just quoted Jung from the Red Book, which just sort of re-emphasizes that point. Humanity stands in between the bird and the serpent. You will meet the other only in human form. If you want to become, then a battle between the bird and serpent breaks out. So the human experience is caught up in this crucifixion, if you like, between the bird and the serpent. And in this idea of the spirituality, the syzygy of spirituality and sexuality, we have Jung's concept of the anima and animus, which for Jung, every man carries within him an unconscious feminine element, which he termed the anima, and correspondingly, every woman carries within her an unconscious masculine element, which he called the animus. The anima is the personification of the man's unconscious feminine and vice versa. And it's important to note these personifications are archetypal rather than personal. And it's consistent with Jung's theory that emerges out of the seven sermons and the rest of its psychology of the psyche as a self-regulating system. And the anima compensates for a man's conscious identity, and a woman's masculine animus compensates for a conscious feminine identity. One thing to note here is very black and white, with no account of the nuances of gender identification and sexual expression that we're more familiar with today. But I think the important thing we can get from this is the ego is compensated by an unconscious anima-animus complex, which takes the opposite gender to whatever we identify with. So the more one identifies as male, the more feminine this complex will take on in the unconscious, and vice versa. Okay, so moving on to salvation. For the Gnostics, salvation is derived from gnosis, whereas ignorance leads to its opposite, leads to evil. And we have the same in the seventh sermon. Salvation is the elevation of consciousness through the process of differentiation. For Jung, the opposites cancel each other in the pleroma, but not in us. Distinction from the opposite is what saves us. And we have something similar in the Gospel of Philip. Ignorance is the mother of all evil. Ignorance leads to death. Ignorance is a slave, knowledge is freedom, and so on. in what I see in salvation is what I describe as a horizontal union of opposites. And this is a significant aspect of Valentinian soteriology, is this reunion of male-female syzygies that were separated in the beginning. And reversing that separation is what will return us to the primordial state of androgynous unity. And here we have, when Eve was in Adam, there was no death. And if they hadn't been separated, we would not know death. And in the 7 sermons, we have something similar. Creation begins with this male-female differentiation, which we see in Abraxas, the hermaphrodite. So I've said here in the 7 sermons in Jungian psychology in general, salvation involves a uniting of the opposites through reconciliation and an integration in a way in which they remain differentiated. And that's one of the key distinctions between Jung's myth and the Gnostic myth, is that the opposites don't dissolve into one another, they remain differentiated in Jung's psychology. And in Jung's psychology, there's no return to the primal unity of the great invisible spirit or the monad. I'll skip across that quote to moving on to the soul. Okay, I'm going to skip across this because I'm running a bit short of time. Okay, so I'll just call out something here. In the Gospel of Thomas, for example, we have this bringing together the two opposites. When two make peace with each other in one house, you become human children. And similarly, in Jung psychology, it requires both sides of polar opposition and their integration to achieve what he called individuation or self-realization. In Jung's work, I also see what I describe as a vertical union of opposites. In the Gnostics myths, we have this idea of the descent of spirit to be reunited with its counterpart, the soul, from whom it's separated. And the soul and spirit represented in the bride and bridegroom in the exegesis of the soul become reunited in the bridal chamber. And redemption is this salvation in the bridal chamber. And I see, putting that together, I see this, we have a vertical union of the opposites in spirit and soul, and we have a horizontal union of opposites in male-female in this vertical plane of existence. Another key concept that we have in both Jungian psychology and the Gnostics is this idea of resurrection happening in this life. Salvation through gnosis must be achieved in this world. And similarly, in Jung's Gnostic myth, the dead came back from Jerusalem having failed to find what they sought. So these were Christians that hadn't found resurrection in this life. And Jung says the dead, knowing only what they knew at the moment of death and nothing beyond that. So similarly for Jung, salvation has to be achieved in this life. Only here on earth, where the opposites clash together, can the general level of consciousness be raised. The dead demand to attain in death that share of awareness which they failed to win in life. So again, we have this concept, resurrection needs to occur in this life. And we have again in the Gospel of Philip, people who say they will die first and then arise are wrong. If they do not receive resurrection first while they are alive, they will receive nothing when they die. Next topic is individual eschatology, which we see similarities between the soteriologies of the 7 sermons and Gnostic myths. And there's significant differences in what they see as the goal of salvation. In the 7 sermons, we have what Jung calls immeasurable distance, a lonely star stands in the zenith. And this star for Jung is the one God or one human, and that is our divinity. And that one star is the ultimate goal of Jung's Gnostic myth. So for Jung in the 7 sermons, the source is the pleroma, but the goal is this divine child, this star God. And he states that you have the one God, wonderfully beautiful, kind and solitary, star-like and moving, which leads you among all the darkness and death scares of dreadful Abraxas. This one star gives you joy and peace, since he is beyond death and beyond what is subject to change. You have the one God and you become your one God. And this is in sharp distinction to the pleroma out of which we emerge. In distinction in the Gnostic myth, the goal is the return to the primordial state that existed prior to the emergence of the cosmos and humanity. Stated otherwise, the goal is to extract the immortal essence, the design spark, from this world and return it to the Godhead. So for Jung, the Gnostic goal of a return to the primordial state would involve a dissolution of ego consciousness, and that would be unconsciousness and death. So they're quite opposite in that regard. The next concept that emerges from the seven sermons of Jung's concept of the self, and I see a precursor to this concept of the self as the star god in the seven sermons. The self in Jungian psychology is, we might describe as the order and unifying centre of the totality of the psyche, including both consciousness and unconscious. And in the same way that the ego is the centre of the conscious mind alone, the self is the centre of both conscious and unconscious mind. So in Jungian psychology and his Gnostic myth, we see three states. We have the undifferentiated opposites which cancel each other in the pleroma. We have the differentiated opposites that are effective in leading to creation, that manifest in the unindividuated individual. And then thirdly, the final state in Jungian psychology is the unified yet undifferentiated opposite, yet differentiated opposites that are realized by the fully individuated individual and are contained within the self or the one God in the seven sermons. So the self, Jung describes as a God image representing the totality of consciousness, the union of opposites, of both unconscious and all opposites of that. And Jung describes Christ as a symbol exemplifying the archetype of the self. So the goal in Jungian psychology, or his Gnostic myth, is realization of Christ. It's not God realization, it's Christ realization. It's attaining this one star God. It's not a return to the pleroma. So it's not God realization, but Christ realization. And that is in sharp distinction to the Gnostics themselves, who saw a return to the pleroma. And we have another accordance with Eckhart. It's a return to the Godhead, and it's not a return to the Godhead. It's the creation of Christ, our God. So putting all that together, we have the pleroma in Jung's conceptualization at the bottom. It's the collective unconscious. It's the pleroma out of which everything emerges through a process of the differentiation of opposites. First with Abraxas containing God and devil, differentiated opposites, leading to the reconciled and integrated opposites, and ultimately, after this life, the one God. Sean, how am I doing for time?
You're doing pretty good. I mean, we can, if we got to go 5 minutes over into lunch, I'm fine with that too. But yeah.
How much more time have I got?
On the clock, we've got 30 minutes, but we can go over if you need a little bit more time. Yeah, you're doing okay.
30 minutes is fine.
Okay.
Okay. The next concept is moving on to the transcendent function, which is the second of the twin texts. So as I mentioned before, I see the seven sermons as the mystical revelation, the Gnostic-inspired revelation that Jung had during the period of his confrontation with the unconscious. The parallel text is the transcendent function, which is the more sanitized psychological interpretation of his experience. And it's fascinating that he starts that essay by claiming that there's nothing mysterious or metaphysical about the transcendent function. And I find it curious that he feels the need to make that claim in a text which is, on the face of it, a psychological text, and yet he makes reference to the mysterious and the metaphysical. And I think that's because, as I say, it was his attempt to understand this very mystical, very mysterious, very Gnostic experience that he was having, and which became the 7 Sermons. So the transcendent function is, and this is not really known well amongst Jungian circles, never mind outside of Jungian circles, but Jung regarded this as the most significant factor in psychological process. And it is, in fact, the driving force towards this concept of individuation, which is Jung's idea of psycho-spiritual growth. And it's the inherent urge towards psychological wholeness. The transcendent function, it can be many things. It can be seen as the process itself, it can be seen as a psychological function, and it can be seen as the method, and it can actually be seen as the result of the transcendent function, which Jung described as the third thing. It's called transcendent in that it leads to a higher state of consciousness, according to Jung. And as mentioned before, Jung sees the psyche as self-regulating, in which the unconscious is in a complementary or compensatory relationship to consciousness, quite often in opposition to it. And due to the self-regulating nature, the psyche, through the ego, attempts to facilitate a dialogue between these two counter positions with a view to integrating them. And we could say the confrontation of the two counter positions results in an energetic tension, out of which, according to Jung, a living third thing emerges not a logical stillbirth, but a movement out of suspension between a living birth that leads to a new level of being, is how Jung describes it. And here's how I would diagram it. It's not a fusion or a composite of the opposite, but a creative synthesis that leads to what he describes as a living third thing that includes both opposite and yet transcends them. And I can't think of a better way of presenting that in imagery than the Taoist yin-yang symbol. Or perhaps better described as you have, mother, father, child. A child is a unique being. It's a product of the mother and the father, but it's not just a composite of mother and father. It's a new, unique being. So in my book, I described it as the action of the transcendent function leads to a new conscious attitude, against which the self-regulating unconscious takes another compensatory counterposition, which in turn ushers in another round of dialectical exchange, mediated by this psychological function known as the transcendent function, which will result in another synthesis, which will manifest in the psyche as a reconciling symbol. So just repeating that, the living third thing is a totality that transcends the opposite, it unites. So the psychological conflict inherent in the opposition of consciousness and unconscious cannot be resolved at the same level of consciousness at which conflict exists. So through the action of consciousness, or the transcendent function, consciousness is raised to a higher level. And the resolution of the conflict brought about by the action of the transcendent function necessitates a transcendence to a higher level of consciousness. And there's an echo of something that Albert Einstein said, that a problem cannot be solved at the same level it was created. You need to move to a higher level of thinking to solve the problem. And I think Jung's saying the same thing here. And just to recap the process, the thesis is followed by antithesis, and through their interaction, a third thing emerges, which is an outcome, which Jung says was previously imperceptible. Jung himself, in the transcendent function essay, describes it as a new attitude. The transcendent function, gained in the course of analysis, tends sooner or later to become inadequate in one way or another, and necessarily so because the constant flow of life again and again demands fresh adaptation. Adaptation is never achieved once and for all. So it's an ongoing process. Consciousness will adopt a position. Unconscious will compensate with its opposite. And then through this dialectical exchange, a third thing will emerge, and so on and so on. And here I've diagrammed that we have the unconscious and the conscious. And if those two positions are mediated by the ego, it will invoke this concept of the transcendent function, which will eventually lead to the emergence of what Jung described as the concept of the self. And here we have that quote from Jung: "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble and can never be solved, but only outgrown, in which some higher or wider interest appears in the patient's horizon." So the fundamental problem is outgrown as the transcendent function kicks in or is invoked, and that leads to the emergence, the gradual emergence of a more conscious self. Excuse me. And Jung's process, which he describes in the transcendent function, is this active imagination process, which proceeds by eliciting the unconscious counterposition in the form of an image. It might be a dream image, an inner visualization, an artwork, writing, or whatever, and then holding that image in your mind's eye and seeing what happens to it. And it will transform in some way. Alternatively, you can personify that image in some way as if it were an autonomous being and somehow separate from yourself. And then you enter into some dialectical exchange with it. And that's the imagination part. And then you have to work out how you're going to relate to that unconscious content, which the unconscious is throwing up in contrast to the conscious position that you hold. And then you somehow, through that conscious mediation, you reconcile these two differences and you arrive at a new conscious attitude, and that's the active part. And some of these slides that I've been showing you, these images, are from Jung's Red Book, as I mentioned, and this was his engagement with the material. So he would draw this material that was coming up, that was welling up from the unconscious during his confrontation with the unconscious. So he would draw the artwork and then he would enter into a dialogue with it. And then as he come to understand the meaning of it, which he documented in the scrutinies part of the Red Book, of which the Seven Sermons is part, he would come to terms with the meaning of it, and the way he achieved that was through this process of active imagination, which he describes in the Transcendent Function essay, which I like to think of as the twin text of the Seven Sermons. And here I've described it as active imagination is a technique that Jung developed for eliciting and developing these fantasies, the aim of which is to engage with and assimilate unconscious content, giving a voice to it, and then establishing that dialogue between consciousness and unconscious and invoking the transcendent function. Okay. So moving quickly along, can we consider Jung a Gnostic? Well, just to recap, all Jung's major contributions to the field of psychology, for example, collective unconscious, the ego-unconscious relationship, the shadow, the anima-animus, the self, they all have precursors in his Gnostic-inspired text, the Seven Sermons, and I've tried to highlight what we've just gone through. However, Jung strenuously denied that he was a Gnostic, or even a mystic, or given to metaphysical speculation. He went to enormous length that he was an empiricist, a scientist, a psychologist. As I just mentioned, he was grounded in empiricism, and he repudiated the Gnostic designation as an invention of his critics. However, on closer inspection, I think if we evaluate Jung's work in a series of characteristics that I think are essential to the Gnostic text, and these are a transcendent ultimate divinity, some degree of ontological dualism, that draws a distinction between this world and the spatial-temporal material world, an innate spiritual nature we know as the divine spark, the idea that gnosis is salvific, The idea that Gnosis is mediated in some way by an emissary from the transcendent realm and an escape of a design spark from this material world and a return to the origin. I've raced through those, but I'll go into them in a bit more detail. I see those as the essential characteristics of your typical Gnostic text, and I evaluate Jung against the Gnostics within those characteristics. So the first one, transcendent ultimate reality. In the Gnostics, we have a wholly transcendent alien God in which humanity is both spatially and temporally separated from the divine. However, for Jung, we have a pleroma which is both transcendent and immanent. Humanity is neither spatially nor temporally separated from the pleroma, yet distinct in our experience. So was Jung a Gnostic in this sense? Yes, but perhaps not quite. So I'll give it a tick, but maybe not sure. In terms of ontological dualism, in the Gnostics we have this idea of an ineffable, wholly transcendent realm of light versus a material world of darkness, a radical dualism where we have this valuation of spirit good, matter bad. Whereas for Jung, the basic theme of the Seven Sermons is differentiation of opposites. The crux of Jungian psychology is this reconciling integration, so it's inherently dualistic, but without the judgment. So yes is without a doubt Gnostic in that sense, in the sense that we have this ontological dualism. The divine spark, yes, I mean, that's obviously there in Gnostics. Our innermost fundamental essence is this essence of the divine spark, identical with but largely forgotten, the microcosm within the microcosm, perhaps. In Jung, we have something similar. We are in the pleroma, and the pleroma is in us. Like infinity in a grain of sand or a mustard seed, the entire pleroma exists in us, since great and small are opposites in the pleroma, according to Jung. But he says it's merely assumed but not existing. So we have this paradoxical idea of the divine spark being in us, and we are in the pleroma. So I think, yes, we can say Jung's a Gnostic in that sense. There's a clear correspondence between the divine spark and this idea of the infinity being in us and pervading us. So I give him a tick in that sense. Gnosis is salvific. Well, it's certainly there in the Gnostics. You know, Gnosis is essential for salvation. In Jung, humanity's worst sin is unconsciousness according to sin. So Gnosis for Jung involves the realization of the self. Yet he says life is in this world and to be lived to the fullest, and only by living a life can we free ourselves from it. So he says, live it to the degree that befits you. So yes, I think we can say Jung is Gnostic, but there's that notable difference. So I give him a tick, but maybe, maybe not. Divine emissary. Okay. For the Gnostics, a common theme is a saviour who descends from this transcendent realm of light to impart gnosis to an ignorant humanity who are unaware of the plight in the imprisonment of this realm of darkness. Where with Jung there's no direct equivalent, I don't think. However, there's a parallel concept of the self that imparts its gnosis by way of the symbol and symbol formation. So insofar as we can consider images from the unconscious as mediated by the self, if we can see that as the emissary, the Gnostic emissary, then I think we could say that, yes, there is a divine emissary that presents itself through symbol formation through our dreams. So yeah, I would say there's a metaphorical equivalence, so I give it a tick. Return to origin. For the Gnostics, I see a wholly transcendent divine realm, perfect, immaculate, and so on. Creation seems to be superfluous. That's how it's described by Robert A. Seagal, who we'll get to mention later. And the goal of the Gnostics is a return to the origin. It's a return trip for the Gnostics. Whereas for Jung, it's a one-way trip. Creation emerges out of the Godhead, out of unconsciousness, and there's a one-directional trajectory from the unconscious Godhead to a fully realized God, self, or God, which was the star God that gets a mention in the Red Book. So in that sense, it's an emphatic no. The Gnostics and Jung are completely at odds with the ultimate goal. So it's a no for me in that one. So in summary, was Jung a Gnostic? The Gnostic philosophy and Jungian psychology have completely opposing teleologies. So my conclusion is no, I don't think so, for that one reason. So we could describe him as Gnostic, but a Gnostic, no. However, this brings us to alchemy. Sean, I'm thinking we're running out of time. I have a few more slides, but I don't think I'm going to get through them. So I'd love to get into Jung and alchemy, but I might just leave it there and move on to questions and answers.
Well, you're free to keep going if you like. If people have to drop off, they have to drop off. My main thing is I just want to make sure people have an hour between now and the next talk so they can grab some food. But we can continue if you like.
Okay, I'll skip through them if you're okay, because I have a few more slides.
Sure.
So Jung looked for verification of his theories in the works of the Gnostics, but as I mentioned, Nag Hammadi wasn't available to him. He had a few Gnostic texts, but not many. So he mentioned himself, he long sought in vain amongst the Gnostics for verification of his theories, but he felt the conclusion he drew was the Gnostics were too remote. And then he came across a Chinese Taoist alchemical text known as The Secret of the Golden Flower, and he says he found undreamed of confirmation of his Gnostic-inspired ideas. And he also stated that medieval alchemy was the missing link between the Gnostics and his own work. And at this point, he discontinued work on the Red Book and he pursued an exploration of alchemy. And he discontinued his work on the Red Book in mid-sentence and he never completed it. And the rest of his explorations were devoted to alchemy. And his last three major works in the collected works were solely devoted to alchemy and his psychological interpretation of the medieval alchemists. And I mentioned earlier, his final great work was Mysterium Conjunctionis, which was an alchemical his exploration of alchemy. He says in his memoirs, analytical psychology coincided with alchemy, the historical counterpart of my psychology, and the unconscious, providing what he describes as an uninterrupted intellectual chain back to the Gnostics, giving substance to his psychology. So here in one of his final public writings, he says quite emphatically that the roots of all his work are in Gnosticism. In black and white, despite the denials of the Jungian psychology community, Jung himself states that his work is rooted in Gnosticism. And I've described it as the 7 sermons in Jungian psychology might be regarded as a further evolution of the living myth of Western spirituality, in which in a paradoxical way the opposites are embraced and reconciled, and divinity is now seen as both transcendent and immanent. And I'll try and unpack that. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. I think I'm missing a slide there. So I think in the Gnostics, we have that idea of a wholly transcendent alien God, whereas in the medieval alchemists, where their pursuit was transforming lead into gold, so the lead was somewhat immanent. So what our concept of divinity, our evolution, emerged out of the lead that was within us. Whereas I think reconciles both those ideas in his psychology, and we have the idea of the transcendent and yet immanent pleroma, out of which consciousness emerges through the differentiation of those opposites. and then their subsequent integration and reconciliation. So as Jung said himself, I think we have that uninterrupted chain from Jungian psychology back through the medieval alchemists all the way back to Gnosticism, proving that Jungian psychology is firmly rooted in Gnosticism. So in line with the theme of conclave, I thought we'd have a quick look at Jungian Gnostic practice. Individuation is 3 stages. First is shadow work, which is described as the apprentice piece of becoming whole. Then we have the integration of the anima animus, which is the masterpiece that should be of becoming whole in Jung's description. And then finally the self, which is the archetype of becoming whole. And Jung says one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable, therefore not unpopular. I'll skip that one. So I think what we can learn from Jung in terms of Gnostic praxis is shadow work. If we avoid the shadow and seek only light, a shadow will still be cast. We need to accept and assimilate its contents, and only then will the shadow vanish. Failing to do that, we get into this concept of spiritual bypassing, which was first coined by, I think he's an American Western psychologist, John Welwood, who described this concept of spiritual bypassing as using spiritual practice to avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. So in Jungian terms, if we attempt to transcend to the spiritual realms without first having dealt with the raw and messy business of our humanness, it's going to fail. So from Jung's point of view, only to the extent that we descend into the unconscious and expose ourselves over and over to the annihilation of that lower part of the soul can we recover the lost living soul. And I think that is best exemplified in this symbol of the Celtic tree, where we unite the opposites of the unconscious or the conscious, or we ascend only to the degree that we descend into the shadow contents of the unconscious, reconcile them, work through them, and only to that degree can we ascend to the more transcendent spiritual realms. Or as Jung says, no tree it can said can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. And the way to do that in Jungian terms is to look at our dreams. He claimed that the dreams were important guiding influences on his theories, but also his major life transitions. He listened to his dreams. He describes dreams as the inner truth and reality of the dreamer as it really is, not as one might conjecture it to be, and not as the dreamer would like it be, but as it actually is. He describes a dream as a psychological fact, an autonomous and meaningful product of psychic activity. It tells us what's going on in our psyche. It tells us what the unconscious compensation for any out of balance consciously psychic position we might take. And in keeping with this self-regulating notion of the psyche, in which there's that relationship between conscious and unconscious, our dreams will give us that compensatory behavior, which we can then use to invoke the transcendent function, leading to our growth in consciousness and ultimately realizing the self. So both conscious attitude and the unconscious compensation are required to successfully understand the dream, according to Jung. And the expression of the unconscious, a dream is the expression of the unconscious at a point of time. So it's almost always of a very individual nature, adding to the conscious psychological situation of the moment, all those aspects which are essential for a totally different point of view, i.e. it's the unconscious compensating for a conscious position, allowing this invocation of the transcendent function and leading to self-realization, which I've just mentioned there. And I describe dreams as a packet of gnosis. tailored to the dreamer's unique circumstance in the given moment. And best of all, it's delivered free every night right to your door. And there, in a sort of mythopoetic utterance, Jung describes a dream as a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recess of the psyche, opening into that cosmic night which was psyche long before there was ever ego consciousness, and will remain psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness may extend. In dreams we put on the likeness of what more universal, true, more eternal humanity dwelling in the darkness of primordial night. I think that's a beautiful quote, so I just wanted to share that with you. And in the Red Book, he describes dreams as the speech of his soul. I must carry them in my heart and go back and forth over them in my mind, like the words of the person dearest to me. Dreams are the guiding words of my soul. So, closing remarks. I'll share the slides. I won't go through these now. I'll skip through this quickly because we are running out of time. I'll skip the shameless plug for my book. And I want to leave you with this passage from the Exegesis on the Soul, one of my favourite pieces from the whole of Nag Hammadi. I'll let you read that for yourself, and I'll add to it, if nothing else, Jung's Red Book and the Seven Sermons were his attempt to reunite with his own soul. And I think it's only with reconnecting with our own soul then that we can make space for the spirit, the emissary from light, to come into us and help us return back to the pleroma. That is the resurrection from the dead and the ascent back to heaven. And that's it. If we haven't run out of time, I'm welcome to take any questions.
I will open up with a comment and a question. And as Jonathan likes to point out, lots of people make comments in the form of questions. First of all, that was fantastic. Let me bring everybody else into view here. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for doing that. That's probably actually the best summary of Gnosticism in Jung that I've ever seen, and I've seen a few of them. So yeah, that's quite impressive. Thank you kindly. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we tried to throw cash at Dr. Douglas, but he said no. So he asked that we make a donation. So the AJC is donated to Heart to Heart International, a nonprofit that works to increase access to healthcare. So we've done that particularly because obviously healthcare in the world is at the forefront of everybody's concerns. So I wanted to mention that we were able to do that on his behalf, and also thank you for letting us do so. My comment that I was going to mention, in our parish here in Calgary, in the parish of St. Joseph, we talk about quite a bit about Gnosticism and about Jung, because some of our parishioners are big fans, obviously, of both. And we've lovingly made lots of jokes about Abraxas as the chicken with a whip. It's become almost kind of a meme inside the parish, and I've never seen a lot of people kind of deal with Abraxas purely from the Gnostic standpoint. So I find Abraxas from the Jung standpoint a lot easier to wrap my head around. And I mean, I've spent a fair bit of time with Gnostic scripture, so having an easier way to understand it is good. And as you were discussing kind of Abraxas in Jung's cosmology, at first I was thinking, oh, this sounds a lot like the logos in the cosmology of Martinez de Pasquale of Martinism. And then as you continued, I'm like, no, it's more like Cthulhu. So, I guess depending on what side of the bed you wake up on. And I guess my question here, and I'm going to make sure that I can get everybody to, people can unmute themselves. Good. The one thing I was going to mention about Jung not identifying as a Gnostic, and I can't remember where I heard this. This doesn't originate from me, but there was a comment I heard in the last year, perhaps in podcasts that I listened to, that perhaps Jung put some distance between himself between himself and the Gnostic label because, not because he was engaging new territory in his field, and Gnosticism represented something older and established, if forgotten, and that perhaps he wanted to put some distance between his ideas as being old and his new work so as to not have it dismissed. Is that fair or on crack, I guess?
Yeah, I think also the field of depth psychology was emerging and it was trying to establish itself. And I think Jung went out on a limb as far as he could because that's where the fruit is, but I think he went as far as he could. And I think if he'd gone any further, he would just have been dismissed as a mystic, an occultist, a crackpot. And I think he struggled to just try and keep academic, scholarly, and psychological credibility. And I think he went as far as he could. And if he'd gone any further, then he would have been lost to us. So I think privately, he did, as I mentioned, in his memoirs, he explicitly stated he had a heritage of Gnosticism, but he didn't say that till right at the end of his life. And all through his life, I think he felt he had to deny it. And I think Jungian circles today still deny it, even though it's written in black and white. And that's where I attempted to do in my research, was just show quite explicitly that all of his ideas were in the Seven Sermons, and he said that himself. All of his major contributions were there pre-configured in the Seven Sermons.
We got some raised hands here. We'll go with Christian.
So going off of this, the idea of like the two opposites in the whole, there's in Alan Watts's book, The Taboo on Knowing Who You Are, he gives this illustration of a magnet and how oftentimes, we see the two separate poles, and like if you just see the North Pole, then you think that that's all there is, or the South Pole, you think that's all it is. But to see the magnet as a whole is different. And to go off of that analogy a little bit, it seems that maybe Jung was saying not to hold the magnet itself, but to observe the forces maybe, and like seeing the actual forces of the polarities a little bit, and holding those together. Would that be correct?
I think certainly when you engage in this concept of the transcendent function, it's kind of difficult because the ego has to mediate that, and that's where the active part comes in. And it has to try and see the position of the ego itself, the conscious position, and then see what compensation the unconscious is throwing up through automatic writing, dreams, reveries, fantasies, and so on. And then the ego has to sort of try and distance itself from its own position, see the compensating position, and then hold it in that state of tension. And Jungians will always talk of this tension of the opposites. And I see it as like pulling apart like an elastic band, and it's or a rubber band, and it's when you pull it apart, it has energy, it's tension. And it's that tension which gives energy that you can then use to sort of psychically propel the formation of the third thing. Whereas if you just let the two sides go, it becomes inert. There's no tension, there's no psychic energy. So yes, very much so, you've got to see both poles. Because there is no one pole. I mean, it's, certainly in this earth plane, or this spatio-temporal plane, you can't have one pole without the other. There is no up without down. There is no left without right, and no hot without cold. This world is founded on those dualities, those opposites. So yes, certainly in terms of Jung's conceptualization of psychological growth, you've got to be able to hold those two opposites, and it can feel like a crucifixion, psychologically speaking. And I think Abraxas is, with the human torso stretched between those poles of God and devil, it can feel like that. No one said it was going to be easy. But hopefully that answers your question. I totally agree. We have to see both poles in a magnet. we have to see both sides of the coin. We have to embrace both opposites.
Yeah. Also, just a quick
sorry, go ahead.
just a quick comment on the whole dualism versus monism thing. I think Jonathan Stewart's podcast, in a recent episode, he went through a really good point on that, and how Gnosticism often gets this kind of dualistic heavy emphasis, but like the more you look into it, you can like see the monadic influence on it as well. So, and maybe that's what his question's about. I guess I'll let him talk now.
As you mentioned, relevant to that, we've had numerous scholars over the years, focusing on Gnosticism and the Nag Hammadi talk. We've had 3 or 4 different talks over the last decade and a half on the Apocrypha of John, and I've always hit them with the same question. Is the Gnostic worldview fundamentally dualistic or monistic? And almost all of them have come back with the same thing, either qualified dualism or qualified monism. So I think, and these are the folks that are current in their field, Glycoplasia, Berger Pearson, Karen King, and they've come back with the same answer, which fundamentally, in my opinion anyway, aligns with what Jung's talking about here. Reverend Jonathan.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Douglas, thank you so much. An amazing presentation, and really close to my own interests, and I think just anybody interested in Gnosticism at all's interests. My question wasn't, but thank you, Christian. That wasn't my question, but the comment. I'm on Team Monism when it comes to Gnosticism, For first a comment, then a question, Dr. Douglas. When you were talking about some of the possible differences between Jung's soteriology and Gnostic soteriology, right? Which is for Jung, you become this individuated being, right? You reconcile the opposites, and in some readings of Gnosticism, you go back into the primeval ocean that is the unknown Father, right? You dissolve. But I would argue, or I'd suggest that, and of course, talking about Gnosticism is always difficult because there's Gnosticisms and different texts. That actually some of the early Gnostic groups had a soteriology similar to what you're talking about with what Jung believes. That at the end of when human beings are saved, instead of becoming part of the unknown Father, the pleroma is quote unquote fixed, because the pleroma is originally the harmonious joining of the aeons, right? And the aeons actually have, even though they are united in divine unity, are also individuated, right? They're individual emanations that are united to each other and to the unknown Father. So I would argue that some of the early Gnostics, this is this is the future that they saw for humans, that we would become aeons united in this in this divine relationship. So there is still that. I find that similar to sort of Jung, right? You're individuated in a way, but you're your true self. So that's the comment. Here's the question, Doctor. Do you know if Jung had any contact, influence, dialogue with contemporary esotericists and Gnostics? Because, of course, the Gnostic church revivals in the 1890s, you have the Theosophy, you have Martinism, you have all these sort of esoteric groups running around in his backyard, calling themselves Gnostic and, dealing with Gnosticism. Was he talking to them? Was he influencing them? Were they influencing him? It just seems kind of strange he'd have this strong interest in the Gnostics and not, go talk to some contemporary Gnostics.
As far as I'm aware, he didn't recognize any of that publicly. Privately, I don't know, but I think it would be reasonably fair to assume that he must have had some contact with whatever esoteric groups that were extant during his time. I mean, it's almost inconceivable that he wouldn't. I mean, you can't have that interest and devote your life to these kind of things and not, if there's a group meeting down the road, I mean, you're not going to know them. So the short answer is I've no idea, and I haven't come across anything that says there is one autobiography which I haven't read. I think is it by Richard Moll or something, or the Occult or the Jung or something. I haven't read it. I think I've heard it's a bit of a hit piece. But personally, I'm not aware of him publicly stating that he was involved in any of those groups. Like I was saying earlier, he wanted to maintain his credibility in all sorts of academic and scholarly and psychological circles. So I think he was at great pains for his whole life to deny it and try and maintain that credibility.
Right. Thank you so much.
Any other questions, comments? Everybody ready for lunch? Okie dokie. Well, with that, that's what we will do. We will break for lunch. Stuart, thank you kindly. That was utterly fantastic. I really enjoyed that, and I hope, if it's possible, to get a copy of your slides. That way we can integrate them with the video, or at least allow people to read at their leisure. That was fantastic. I mean, you literally wrote the book on it. So, and while Dr. Douglas may not want to do the shameless self-promotion, I have no problem, promoting whether he likes it or not. Yeah, he has a couple of books out there. The one of them, which flashed up on the screen earlier, was The Apocalypse of the Reluctant Gnostics, which dealt with Carl Jung and Philip K. Dick, who we're going to be hearing from Monsignor Scott Rasbach on later. So I don't know how late that is your time, but of course you're welcome to join us for the rest of the lectures, or any lectures as you're able. And I'll also send you a copy of all that as well, if you want to get some sleep. So that works too.
It'll be a bit late for me, but I'd love to hear Scott's talk.
Excellent. Well, thank you kindly. That was fantastic.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Phil, enjoyed it.
The stars aligned. Yeah, the stars aligned quite well. So yeah, and like I said, it's good to see your face again and hear your voice. And in the intervening time, you've become the expert, and that definitely comes through in the presentation. That was really, really good. For everybody else, we're going to reconvene in roughly an hour and 15 minutes. We have Reverend Rick Beck from the Moravian Church, now working with the Roman Catholic Diocese of Calgary, to talk about the process of spiritual direction. So grab some lunch, grab a nap, depending on what time zone you're in, and I'll see you guys then. Thank you kindly. And Stuart, thanks again, and I'll catch you in all the usual places. Don't be a stranger.
Okay, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.